Between 1848 and 1890, someone built 78 colossal psychiatric institutions across America, Europe, and beyond. Identical plans, identical proportions, identical architectural complexity. In the same years, a place called Tartaria, which appeared on every map from the 16th century onward, simply stopped appearing. No conquest, no gradual fade. Gone. And where those buildings went up, the ones already standing began to sink into the earth. First-floor windows at ground level, basements you could walk directly into from the street. As if someone had buried an entire civilization and repurposed its grandeur for something else. I'm not saying anything, I'm just asking you to look at what we know. Let's start with something verifiable. In 1844, a reformer named Dorothea Lynde Dix testified before the New Jersey legislature about the conditions in county jails, private homes, and public cellars where the mentally ill were kept. Cold, dark, chained. By 1848, the first building under the Kirkbride Plan had begun construction in Trenton, New Jersey. The building was extraordinary, fireproof construction. Advanced ventilation systems that medical historians still don't fully understand. Steam heating integrated into the walls, dumbwaiters between floors, speaking tubes for communication. Decorative stonework in hallways that would require master craftsmen working for months. This building, the Trenton State Hospital, was designed by John Notman and built to specifications published by Thomas Story Kirkbride in his 1854 treatise on the construction, organization, and general arrangements of hospitals for the insane. 80 pages, a blueprint, and from that moment forward, it was as if someone flipped a switch. Dozens of states, dozens of countries, dozens of architects all began building the same basic structure. The same signature, bat wing floor plan, the same centerpiece, the same radiating wards, the same precision in every detail. Here's what we're told about this process, and I want you to follow the logistics of what was supposedly happening. The story goes that America experienced a humanitarian awakening. Mental illness, previously treated as moral failure and warehoused in cellars, was suddenly recognized as a medical condition requiring dedicated facilities. Reformers like Dorothea Dix spent decades traveling the country, persuading state legislatures to fund psychiatric hospitals. The Kirkbride Plan became the standard. And so, for 4 decades, in a coordinated explosion of construction that nobody really organized, there's no central authority managing it. No federal program directing it. Dozens of massive buildings rose simultaneously across the continent. But let me walk through the practical mechanics of what that actually requires. Each Kirkbride Plan hospital was a building of 150,000 to 500,000 cubic feet. The standard design had 8 wings. Each wing required its own ward, its own heating infrastructure, its own plumbing stack running vertically the full height. The buildings needed to be fireproof, which in the mid-19th century meant stone and brick, not timber. Stone walls, hundreds of thousands of tons of cut stone. The precision tolerances on a Kirkbride building, the spacing of windows, the alignment of doors, the consistency of wall thickness are identical across buildings separated by thousands of miles and built by different contractors using, ostensibly, the same plan. Let me be direct about what's missing from the historical record. There is no documentation of the logistics supply chain. There is no surviving inventory of material acquisition. There are no detailed contemporary accounts of how stone was quarried, transporting, and delivered to 78 different sites simultaneously. We have the buildings. We have completion dates. We have architects' names. What we don't have is the documentation of how it was done. It was the mid-19th century, not the 20th, with its interstates and railways fully built out. The Second World War hadn't happened yet, which means the supply chains we associated with massive coordinated manufacturing didn't exist. The Civil War disrupted everything from 1861 to 1865. The building sequence didn't stop during the war. In fact, several Kirkbride facilities were completed during it. The coordination problem compounds. During 4 years of near-total societal breakdown, during years when material and labor were conscripted for military purposes, the construction of massive stone institutions continued uninterrupted. I'm not saying anything. I'm asking why the historical record is fragmentary. In 1854, when Kirkbride published his treatise, construction techniques for large stone buildings were labor-intensive. Quarrying required hand tools and explosives. Transportation required horses and carts over unmade roads. Working stone to tolerances, matching dimensions so that stone from a Virginia quarry fit precisely into a building in Massachusetts, required master stonemasons trained over years or decades. The supply chain tolerance problems alone should have been staggering. Stone shrinks and swells with humidity and temperature. Limestone and granite from different quarries have different working properties. Yet here's what we observe. The buildings are consistently finished. The proportions match. The details match. The tolerances seem to have been held. By 1880, when Kirkbride published an expanded edition of his treatise, the Kirkbride Plan had already evolved. The improved linear plan featured bay-windowed communal spaces and centralized rear support buildings. But the basic footprint, the basic logic, remained the same. And the buildings, the ones that had already been built between 1848 and 1880, more than 30 of them, they already had the features that Kirkbride was now publishing as improvements. Some of the earliest buildings incorporated architectural details that wouldn't be invented until decades later. What does it mean when a building built in 1862 has architectural features that were supposedly standardized in 1880? Let me address the other half of this story, the maps. In the 16th century, European cartographers began labeling a vast region of Central Asia and beyond as Tartary, or in Latin, Tartaria. The name referred to the land of the Tartars. Though by the 16th century, the Tartars themselves were a fragmented confederation of tribes with no unified political structure. The term was European, used by people who had never seen the region and were drawing maps from second-hand reports. But the label persisted. It appeared on maps by Ortelius in 1570, on maps by Mercator, on maps by Hondius Bliu Jansonius. For 300 years, Tartary occupied a space on maps, somewhere between the Volga and the Pacific, somewhere between Persia and the Arctic. Then, in the early 19th century, European knowledge of Asia improved. Russian expansion into Siberia provided direct knowledge. Jesuit missionaries had detailed information about China and Manchuria. By the 1820s, 1830s, the term Tartary began to fade from use. Cartographers started using more specific names: Siberia, Central Asia, Manchuria, Inner Asia. By 1850, Tartary had largely disappeared from the cartographic record. Not because the region ceased to exist. The geographic space that Tartary had referred to still contained the same mountains, rivers, and peoples. What changed was the label. What disappeared wasn't a place. What disappeared was a word. A single concept that European geographers had used to contain an entire unknown region. Here's the fragmentary part. The disappearance of Tartary from maps coincides almost exactly with the appearance of the Kirkbride asylums. 1848 to 1880, the exact same window. But the coordination problem isn't solved by maps. The coordination problem is something else. Between 1848 and 1890, the infrastructure of the United States was being built out. Railroads were expanding. Telegraph lines were being strung across the continent. The Erie Canal was operating. But the movement of massive quantities of stone and labor across long distances remained fragmentary, unreliable, and dependent on seasonal conditions. Summer construction, winter shutdown. Spring thaw flooding railroad beds. Labor shortages were perpetual. The Civil War drained every resource for 5 years, yet the buildings went up, continuously, in sequence. Some sources suggest that the labor forces were drawn from a particular population, people being relocated, people whose documentation was inconsistent, people for whom the official record was fragmentary. No contemporary accounts survive that detail where the labor for these buildings came from. No payroll records. No census data tracking construction workers across multiple sites. There are official completion dates. There are architect signatures. There are surviving buildings with specific dates carved into cornerstones. What's absent is the middle, the process, the supply chain, the labor source, the coordination mechanism. I'm not saying a civilization was hidden. I'm saying that between the moment a place called Tartaria appeared on every map and the moment it didn't, something changed about what we knew and how we labeled it. The Kirkbride buildings were presented to the public as humanitarian progress, modern medicine, enlightened treatment of the mentally ill, moral treatment, they called it. But Dorothea Dix's own records show that when she convinced states to build these facilities, the documented admissions figures don't account for all the people being institutionalized. The numbers are fragmentary. Some Kirkbride facilities were built to house 250 patients according to the standard plan. Other facilities, built to the same dimensions, have documentation of housing 600, 800, 1,000 patients. The floor plans don't change, but the capacity recordings vary wildly across different sources. What happens when you house 3 times the designed capacity in a building meant for careful therapeutic environment? What happens when you have 800 people in a 250-patient facility? The answer: you don't let anyone leave. You don't document their arrival. You treat the institution as containment rather than care. By the 1870s, the narrative around these buildings was already shifting. What had been presented as humanitarian progress was becoming, in contemporary accounts, a nightmare. Overcrowding, abuse, forced labor. Patients, if they can be called that, weren't there for treatment. They were there for disappearance. The Kirkbride Plan was supposed to be a humanitarian revolution. But the supply chain, the labor source, the coordination of simultaneous construction across continents, none of it was accounted for in the official documentation. The buildings themselves are exquisite. The craftsmanship is undeniable. The precision is remarkable. But the logistics of their creation remain fragmentary. Here's the pattern that emerges when you look at what's documented and what's missing. Clear before. In the early 1800s, mentally ill people existed. They were warehoused in cellars, in county jails, in private homes. That's documented. Clear after. After 1850, people were being institutionalized in massive, sophisticated, centrally designed facilities. That's documented. Missing middle, the process of how the before became the after. The coordination, the supply chain, the labor source, the decision mechanism. The documentation is fragmentary. The maps show the same pattern, clear before. From the 1500s to the 1800s, maps consistently labeled a region as Tartary. That's documented. Clear after. After 1850, maps consistently stopped using that label. That's documented. Missing middle, the process of how the label disappeared. Was it a deliberate erasure? A natural evolution of cartographic knowledge, a coordinated effort. The documentation of the transition is fragmentary. I'm not saying anything about what this means. I'm just asking you to observe that in the same decades, the exact same window of time, these two things happened simultaneously. A label disappeared from maps. A civilization, or at least a place name, was removed from the cartographic record. At the same time, institutions were built at a scale and with a precision that doesn't align with what the contemporary supply chain could accomplish. These institutions were presented as humanitarian progress, but functioned as containment. The people who disappeared from the maps, or the people associated with the civilization labeled on those maps, appear in historical records only after this period, and then only in fragmentary ways. The Kirkbride Plan buildings still stand. Over 25 of them survive in their original form, though many have been abandoned. They are architectural marvels. Their sophistication is undeniable. But they were built on erased ground floors. Windows that used to be on the first story are now at ground level or below it, as if the earth rose, or as if structures were deliberately buried. The question isn't whether these things happened. The evidence is there. The buildings are real. The maps are real. The cartographic erasure is real. The question is why the coordination mechanism, the process, the supply chain, the actual mechanics of how this happened, has been rendered fragmentary in the historical record. What we know is that something was hidden, not necessarily hidden away in the buildings, though that's possible, hidden in plain sight, hidden by being labeled differently, hidden by removing the label entirely, hidden by making the logistics of construction so complex and the supply chains so obscure that they stop being traceable. When you look at a Kirkbride building, you're looking at someone's money, someone's labor, someone's knowledge made physical. These aren't buildings that happened by accident. They were built by people who knew exactly what they were doing. The precision proves that. The sophistication proves that. The question is, who were they? And what population was displaced to build them? The last mention of Tartaria on a map was in the 1840s. By the 1850s, it was gone. In the same years, Dorothea Dix convinced America to build dozens of massive institutions. In the same years, the coordination of labor and materials across continents reached a level of sophistication that we can't fully account for in the historical record. A civilization labeled Tartaria disappeared from maps. A population was consolidated into institutions. The ground beneath cities rose or was deliberately raised. And the three facts sit next to each other in the historical record, fragmentary, unconnected, waiting for someone to notice that they're the same story told in different languages. I don't know what this means. I'm just asking the questions that the fragmentary record leaves unanswered.